Welcome back to Beyond the Crime, the podcast that takes you into the minds of criminals with your hosts Dr. Lars Madsen, Shay Addison, and Dr. Rob Brockman.
Welcome to Beyond the Crime podcast. Massimo Pigliucci, welcome very much to our podcast. Of course, I've invited you to come on the podcast because of your work within writing about Stoic philosophy. And I'm very excited to have you here today to be able to talk a little bit about this philosophy and how it can be applied for not just the average individual, but for folks who might be going through the criminal justice system and be having to try to find a way to sort of progress out of this. So welcome to the podcast, and I'm very pleased to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Massimo, so tell me, so for the folks who are listening, could you tell me a little bit about, who might be less familiar with Stoicism, how would you describe it in its essence, and why do you believe that this is a philosophy that has endured over 2 millennia?
Yeah, good questions. It's always difficult to give the elevator pitch, as Americans call it, for Stoicism, because it, like any philosophy of life, it's a lot of things. But fundamentally, it is a philosophy of life. That is, it's supposed to be a general framework for how to prioritize things in life, for allow you to think about the meaning of what you do and why do you want to do certain things rather than others. But the fundamental goal of Stoicism is to make you into a better human being. And maybe we can talk later about what that exactly means. But that it's essentially about ethical self-improvement. In that sense, Stoicism is really not different from other philosophies of life, like Buddhism, let's say. Which also has as a major goal, or for that matter, religions like Christianity. The goal usually is always the same: to allow an individual to live a life worth living and to become a good human being. Of course, the different philosophies differ on what that means exactly and how they cash it out. In terms of why it is so popular 2,000 years after, more than 2,000, almost 24 centuries after its inception, I think it's hard to tell because it probably depends on a number of factors. But there's a couple of things that come to mind. Number one, it's just a good idea. It has been time tested, so to speak. Even though formal Stoic schools were closed or disappeared during the rise of Christianity in the 3rd and 4th, 5th century of the Common Era, Stoicism as a set of ideas influenced a lot of the early Christian fathers. It influenced a lot of medieval thinkers, many of whom were Christian. It later on influenced early modern philosophy, the Renaissance, and all the way into the Enlightenment. And finally, the beginning of the modern era, the founding fathers, for instance, at the American Revolution, were definitely influenced by a number of Stoic figures, and so on and so forth. So some of the ideas will be familiar to people, not necessarily because they associate them with Stoicism, but because Stoicism has kind of permeated Western culture for so long. And now, we live in a world that is in many respects similar to the one in which Stoicism first arose. We have to think about it this way. Okay. Stoicism and a number of other philosophies of life, including Epicureanism and skepticism and a few others, they all came out pretty much at the same time during the so-called Hellenistic period. The Hellenistic period goes from the death of Alexander the Great to the Battle of Actium, which is where Octavian, the future first Roman Emperor Augustus, beat the crap out of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, therefore eventually ending the Roman Civil War and beginning the empire. So we're talking about a period that it's bracketed by two major historical events, and everything in between was chaos and turmoil and change all the time. Because after Alexander died, the Macedonian Empire collapsed, first into 3 or 4 different chunks, and then they started fighting against each other. Then Rome came up. So it was a lot of change, a lot of turmoil, social, political, etc. Well, during the 20th and so far in the 20th century, 21st century, we're pretty much in a similar position. We've seen literally seen the fall of other empires. We've seen the fall of the Soviet Union, for instance. We have seen major cultural and political changes throughout the world in the last several decades, and we still see them. I mean, the two of us are talking literally 2 days after the presidential elections in the United States, and that's been quite a change, or it's going to be quite a change.
I know.
So, so people, and that's a kind of a standard way of understanding why these things, these concepts, these philosophies become popular. When people find themselves in a situation of turmoil, change, and especially in a situation in which they cannot really control much, there is not much they can do about all of this change, then they need some kind of point of reference. And Stoicism offers that.
There is perhaps also, and maybe you can clarify this, because within I think the wider community, perhaps there's this perception that Stoicism is simply just about sitting on your emotions, stuffing it down, suppressing emotions. Can you clarify how you actually how Stoicism, as the philosophy, actually approaches emotions? And because it's obviously my impression and experience that Stoicism, the philosophy, as we understand it with a big S, that's not how it approaches sort of emotions, just simply stuffing it down and pretending it's not there.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a difference between the Stoicism with capital S and Stoicism with a little s. So the philosophy versus the sort of common understanding of the attitude. And in fact, Stoicism is not the only one. The same problem arises with 3 of the other Hellenistic schools: Epicureanism, skepticism, and cynicism. All of those words today mean something that is only vaguely related and not really representative of the early version. Just consider Epicureanism, right? Most people think of it today as the philosophy of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But the ancient Epicureans were nothing like that. Yes, they did say that pleasure, and particularly the lack of pain, is the most important thing in life. But, they recommended a life of solitude, or living in small groups with friends, and eating simple food and enjoying the simple pleasures of life. So you can see in that case where the pleasure kind of thing got blown out of proportion, and where the modern word Epicureanism, it kind of distorts the philosophy. The same goes with Stoicism. So 2 of the major modern misconceptions about Stoicism, as you just said, are that it's essentially the stiff upper lip, suppressing emotion kind of things. Basically, Spock from Star Trek. And with all due respect to Spock, who is one of my favorite characters, no, Stoicism is not like that. There is a grain of truth, because the stiff upper lip kind of thing comes out of the fact that one of the virtues of a Stoic is endurance. And, if a Stoic is faced with something that they cannot do anything about, they cannot change, then the rational attitude is, well, then you endure it. What are you going to do? Throw a tantrum? That's not going to help. It's going to make things worse. If you get upset, if you get, angry about things that you cannot change, that's simply going to add injury to the already existing one, and that's a waste of emotional energy. The second issue, the suppression of emotion, there too there is a grain of salt, but again, it's a distortion. So the Stoics, interestingly, divide emotion, what we call today emotions, into 2 major categories: unhealthy and healthy ones. And in fact, they reserve the word emotion for the healthy ones, and they call the unhealthy ones passions. Now, we tend to think that a passion is something positive, right? I have a passion for jazz, or a passion for whatever, right? But in fact, the root of the word passion is the Greek pate, and pathos, from which we get pathology. Right? So which tells you that it's not a good thing. It's a pathology. The Stoics thought, look, some emotions are in alignment with reason. They are the kinds of emotions you want to have because they bring about a good life. And other emotions are contrary to reason. That is, they're the kinds of emotions that get in the way of a good life. So the first category, positive emotions, the healthy emotions, include things like love of your children, love of your partner, love of friends, love of country, and that sort of stuff. So the various different forms of love. Also, a sense of justice, they consider that an emotion. And it's a positive thing. You want to love justice in a sense. But then there are the unhealthy ones. The unhealthy ones include, especially first and foremost, anger. Anger for the Stoics is, Seneca, one of the Stoic writers, says that anger is a temporary madness. He says, just look at the face of somebody who is angry. It's distorted. It's ugly. It's like that of a beast. It's like you don't want to go anywhere close to somebody who is angry. Why not? Well, because even though the anger may be justified in some cases, right? There may be good reasons why you're angry. Maybe an injustice was done to you or to one of your loved ones, or maybe you're just angry at injustice in general, even if it doesn't touch you. The fact that you're angry about it, it means that you're now allowing your emotions to override your ability to reason about things. And so you're probably going to do something that you're going to be regretting. Even though you have good reasons for it, the initial impulse is the right one. If you allow anger to just get going, then you cannot stop it. It overrides everything else. And by the time you can stop it, you've probably done something they're going to regret.
Yeah. Wow. So I guess we're talking about some how do you practically implement Stoic principles into your life? So if we're thinking about what are some practical ways that this can be done for someone, say today or over the next period of time? Like what kind of exercises or strategies might someone who wants to do this or get closer to it, how could they sort of do this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, before I can answer that, let's talk a minute about what I think are the two fundamental Stoic principles. One is what one of the major Stoic writers, Epictetus, who lived at the end of the first century, beginning of the second century, called the fundamental rule. And the fact that he calls it a fundamental rule tells you that it's important. And the other one is the notion of living according to nature. These two notions actually encapsulate a lot of Stoicism. So once we have a little bit of a grasp of these two, then we can talk about how do you actually live like a Stoic, so to speak, like how you actually implement them. So the first one, the fundamental rule, is basically the idea that some things in life are up to us, meaning we're reasonably responsible for them, and other things are not up to us, meaning that we can influence them perhaps, but we're not ultimately responsible for them because they depend on a lot of external factors that we don't control. And for the Stoic, the basic idea is we should have very clear in mind which things are up to us and which one are not up to us. And once you have that thing, that distinction clear in any particular situation, you should do two things. One, focus your attention on the things that are up to you. That's because your agency is efficacious there, right? So if they're up to you, that means you can do something about it. Mm-hmm. And two, prepare yourself with an attitude of equanimity to accept the things that are not up to you because you can't do anything about them. And then therefore, the only reasonable response you can have is, okay, well, this is going to happen. Now, this idea, the fundamental rule, actually pops up in a bunch of different cultures. You find it actually in Judaism, you find it in Buddhism, and you find it also in 20th century Christianity. Perhaps some of your listeners are aware of something called the Serenity Prayer. The Serenity Prayer is a prayer that was written by an American theologian at the beginning of the 20th century. It's used often at the beginning of meetings of 12-step organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, things like that, right? And the prayer basically asks God the wisdom to tell the difference between what I can change and what I cannot change, the courage to change what I can, and the serenity to accept what I cannot. That's basically Epictetus' fundamental rule. And it's not by chance because the Christians got it straight from the Stoics. That's one of those things that got imported directly. So that's the first principle. If you want to live like a Stoic, you have to apply the fundamental rule. The second crucial principle of Stoicism is this notion of living according to nature. Now, that may sound a little strange. Like, what do you mean? I need to go and hug trees in the forest, something like that. It's like, no, there's nothing wrong with hugging trees in the forest, but that's not what we're talking about. Living according to nature means I probably can better explain it by way of an example. Let's say that you're very nice and you invite me over for dinner at your place. So what do? Well, as a guest, I bring, let's say, a bottle of wine. but I also bring maybe a gift. And that gift is going to be, in my case, because I have a background in plant biology, it's going to be a cactus, because I think that a cactus would just do very well in your house. Okay. Now you're responsible for the well-being of the cactus. Now you need to know something about the nature of cacti. Now you might say, "Oh, it's a plant, so it wants a lot of water and a lot of light." And you'd be mistaken. If you go that way, you're going to kill it, because yes, the cactus is a plant, but it's a desert plant. That means it needs a lot of light, but very little water. If you overwater the plant, it's going to die. So in other words, you have to treat the cactus according to its own nature. The way the cactus is going to do well, it's going to have a nice cactus life, is if the conditions are such that are favorable to cactus life. The same idea for the Stoics hold for human beings. Human beings have a nature also. There is a human nature. And so we need to know what human nature is in order to figure out how to live a good life. According to the Stoics, human nature fundamentally comes down to two things. So we have a lot of things in common with other animals, right? We need food, we need water, we need shelter, we don't like violence and all that sort of stuff. That's in common with other animals. So it's not specific to human nature. The things that are specific to human nature are two. One, we are capable of reason much more, to a much higher degree than any other animal. Other animals, there are other intelligent animals, but in terms of explicitly thinking through your problems, that's human beings. Yeah. And we are fundamentally social. Again, there are other social species in nature. There are social insects. There are other social primates, but human societies are far more complicated and more sophisticated than anything else. So for the Stoics, that means that a good human life is a life in which you use your intelligence, your mind, to solve problems, and in which you act pro-socially, that is, cooperatively with other people. You actually work together with other people in order to build a functional society. So these are the two fundamental principles. The fundamental rule, what is up to us and what is not up to us, and then the living according to nature, which turns out to be living according to reason and pro-socially. So how do you actually practice this? Well, let's start with the fundamental rule. I can give you again another example. So every time that I face a possible setback or a challenge, or anything that might be difficult, I ask myself the first question. I train myself to ask the first question: what here is up to me and what is not up to me? So let's say I go, for instance, maybe tomorrow morning for a job interview. It comes natural to people that go to job interviews to focus on what? On the outcome of the interview, right? Am I going to get the job, or am I not going to get the job, right? For the Stoics, that's exactly the wrong thing to do. Because getting or not getting the job, it's not up to you. No. It's up to the interviewer, right? And it depends on a bunch of factors that you don't control. You don't know who the interviewer is, what their priorities are. You don't know what kind of mood they're going to be in tomorrow morning during the interview. You don't know who your competition is, and so on and so forth. There's lots of other stuff that you don't control. What is it that you do that it is up to you in a job interview? Well, to prepare as best as possible. So to do research about the position you're applying for, right? So that you know that there is actually a good match between your skills and the job that they're looking for. To do things like, going to bed early and try to get a good night's sleep, because that helps for the interview. To try to get there on time tomorrow morning. So because going late at the interviews is not a good way to start the day, and try to keep as focused as possible during the interview. Right, that's it. Notice, by the way, that I said try to get a good night's sleep and try to get there on time. Actually getting a good night's sleep or actually getting there on time, that's also not up to me. I have the intention of getting a good night's sleep, but maybe my neighbor is having a party and I can't sleep tonight. That's not up to me. I have the intention of showing up tomorrow at the right time for the interview, and I leave myself plenty of time. I, set the alarm, I dress and all that sort of stuff. But guess what? I get in my car and there is an accident on the road and I'm stuck in traffic. Or I get into the subway and there is a delay and I can't do anything about it. So mostly what it's up to me essentially are my intentions and my decisions to act or not to act in certain ways. The outcomes are not. So the way you practice the fundamental rule is this one. Every time you're facing a situation, mentally, or even sometimes I do it physically, you write yourself a little table. You divide it into two parts and you say, okay, what here is up to me? What is not up to me? And then you start focusing on the list on the left, what is up to you. And you keep repeating to yourself, the stuff on the right, it's not up to me. And I need to be ready and be okay no matter what happens.
Wow. So it really is this kind of like cognitive sleight of hand, isn't it? Because you're really being able to separate things into what you can and what you can't control, and then letting go of that other, the things that can happen just coincidentally in the day.
That's right. Yeah, it's interesting you call it a kind of sleight of hand. That's right. I mean, sometimes people say, oh, but that means that Stoicism is just a series of mental tricks. Well, life is a series of mental tricks. You know, how you approach life. I mean, the Stoics do make this very sharp distinction between facts as they are in themselves and then value judgments. Yeah. And the notion is facts don't come with value judgments. We attach a value judgment to the facts, right? And so Epictetus famously says, it is not facts that bother people, it's opinions about those facts that bother people. The classic example, again, you know, in the case of, you know, your job. Oh, you lose your job. Oh, that's a catastrophe.
Yeah.
Is it? I mean, let's separate the two things, right? The fact is you lost your job. That's a fact. There's nothing you can do about it. That's it's done. Now, whether this is a catastrophe, an opportunity, a neutral thing, that depends on how you think about it and how you react to the situation. As you know, Stoicism was the original inspiration for cognitive behavioral therapy. In two of the early forms, the kind of CBT that Aaron Beck articulated in the late 50s and early 60s in the United States, as well as rational emotive behavior therapy developed by Albert Ellis. And Albert Ellis specifically developed this notion of telling his clients not to catastrophize. Yeah. Not to make everything into, you know, oh, this is a setback, this is horrible, this is like, well, no, it isn't. It is what it is. It's a fact. Now let's think about what you can do with that fact.
It's really interesting. As you're sitting here describing this, I'm just thinking about how many situations, you know, certainly working with the clients that I work with or we work with, is where we're trying to kind of help them, or we're sort of focus on what you can control, focus on what you can do about the situation, because you're stuck in institutions, you're stuck in systems that feel coercive and feel overwhelming and feel perhaps disempowering to you. But in a sense, and they react a lot of the time to that sense of disempowerment or those experiences, the judgments of these experiences, and in a sense that activates anger and frustration and depression, and that's where people get stuck. They just go round and round. Their wheels just spin and spin with
exactly
these experiences, and I guess being able to, you know, what we're saying here, what you're describing is in a sense, this is, you know, like a very much a Stoic principle, is being able to focus on.
That's right. One of my favorite fictional examples of a Stoic attitude. I saw it a few years ago when there was this movie that came out called Bridge of Spies. And one of the main characters was played by Tom Hanks. And there's a scene. So the movie is about an alleged Russian spy who is, during the Cold War, who is captured in Germany and faces trial. And, you know, the possibility is a death penalty. So there's this great scene where Tom Hanks, who plays the spy's lawyer, is talking to his client, and at some point he turns around and says, "You know, you don't seem worried about this thing. You understand that, you know, there's a possibility of death penalty. Aren't you worried?" And the spy, looks at Tom Hanks and says, "Would that help?" And that's the idea, right? If okay, I'm facing death. worrying about it, being upset about it, having anxiety about it, it's not going to help me. Not only it's not going to help me, but it's actually going to make it worse. Yeah. Because again, I might therefore react out of fear or out of anxiety or something like that, and maybe say something that I shouldn't say, or not say something that I should say. So I undermine my own position. But it's a great encapsulation of the Stoic attitude. Well, would it help?
Yeah, would it help?
Is it helpful?
When we're talking about anger, frustration, depression, I guess experiences to things that we might be stuck in, what about folks who have had trauma? A lot of our clients sometimes will have had really challenging, overwhelming childhoods and still struggle with that, as adults. How do you see Stoicism being applied or relevant for individuals who might be struggling with those kinds of issues?
That's a great question. I mean, there are, of course, limits to everything, including to Stoicism. But I know from two sources that Stoicism can be applied also in those cases. And the two sources are, I have colleagues who actually are therapists and who apply either Stoicism directly or CBT, which, as I said, it's derived from it, to those kind of situations. And then I've also read essays written by people with PTSD, for instance, or with depression and so on and so forth, and about their practice of Stoicism. So I think the basic notion is this one. If you are mentally in a situation, let's say clinical depression, where it's known or it's likely that you can benefit from, let's say, medicine, chemicals, by all means, take the chemicals. Because what you want to do is to bring your mind back as close as possible to a functionality that then allows you to make all sorts of other decisions. And then the Stoicism basically helps you, in making that decision of say, okay, this is the most reasonable course of action is to actually get on medications, for instance. So I'm going to do it. And then once the medications actually start to work, now your mind is in a better position to practice the philosophy, right? So the same goes for people that have been affected by traumas. I mean, the trauma is something that, in a sense, and I don't mean this in a belittling sense, it's entirely in your head, unless it's a physical trauma. Right. Of course, if somebody broke your leg, then that's a different issue. But if it is a psychological trauma, it literally is in your head, which means that you have a lot of power to deal with it and to overcome it. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy, right? No. It may take a long time, and it may take a lot of practice to actually get there. But ultimately, that is, in fact, what a Stoic would say, up to you. So a milder version of what we're talking about is the Stoic treatment, the Stoic response to insults, right? So Epictetus says, somebody's insulting you and you're getting upset and you feel offended and then you get angry, and it's like, okay. It's like, well, stop there for a second. It's like, what exactly is going on here? Think about it from an objective perspective. What's going on is that somebody over there, possibly even a stranger, somebody we don't know and you don't care about, is opening their mouth. Air comes out of it. That air gets translated by your ear into words. And now you're getting upset. Well, but it's up to you how to respond to the insult, right? Regardless of what the intention of the other person is. Maybe he intends to, or to, maybe not. Maybe he's just thinking that he's actually giving you good advice, Maybe he's just giving you some tough love from their perspective. Whatever it is that they intend to do, it doesn't matter, because ultimately it's up to you to say, well, what is this? It's just air coming through my ear, and it's up to me to respond in a certain way, or better yet, not to respond at all. Epictetus advises his students to respond to insults like a rock would. It's like, have you ever tried to pick up a rock and start insulting it? Not very satisfying. Why not? Yeah. Because the rock is not answered, right? So you entirely deflate the person that is abusing you, or that is insulting you, because you're not giving them what they want. You're not giving them a reaction. Now, of course, we can say that as adult individuals who have no trauma and all that sort of stuff. If you are a child, it's a whole different thing. And then you carry those kind of memories and that kind of impact you carried into adulthood. But the good news is there is help, and that help is largely up to you. It is up to you to follow whatever medications or whatever suggestions your doctor has, and then it's up to you to think about exactly what that experience means and how you want to react to it.
And I'm just thinking about cognitive processing therapy as you're talking about this, because cognitive processing therapy for trauma is the core intervention is identifying stuck points to the trauma. So that is a perception or a belief or an idea that has formed from the trauma, which kind of keeps the trauma active or stuck for the person. And then the therapy is a process of trying to change or challenge that kind of stuck point. And what you're describing there is in a sense a process, is exactly that. Is that process where you're going, well, for instance, this trauma, a stuck point might be, I'm the cause of it, or I'm to blame for that, right? And
it's my fault.
Yeah. It's my fault. Yeah. I'm a bad person because I allowed this to happen. The therapy then is about going, well, are you really? Like, well, so analyzing and breaking it down in a more healthy and productive way, to allow the person.
And again, it's not a magic bullet. It takes time and it takes effort, right? However, the fundamental Stoic insight is very much in line with not only with modern cognitive behavioral therapy, but with what we know now or begin to know about the nature of emotions and their relationship to reason. I mean, the classic view of emotions, the relationship between emotion and reason, actually goes back to Plato. Yeah. And Plato said, those are two different things. They fight against each other. Yes, this famous metaphor of the charioteer that is trying to control these wild horses. The wild horses are the emotions, and the charioteer is reason. And that sort of antagonistic view of emotions and reason was inherited then by early modern psychoanalysis, Freud, Jung, and people like that. But it just doesn't stand up to modern science. Modern science tells you, both modern cognitive science and neuroscience especially, they tell you that actually the emotions and cognition are deeply intertwined. They're deeply interconnected. Yeah. Yes, it's true that our emotions, anatomically speaking, mostly originate in the back of the brain, the amygdala. Yeah. Right, that's where your fight or flight response comes in. That's where your adrenaline discharge and all that sort of stuff. But those regions are completely integrated with the frontoparietal lobes, which are where our rational faculty, our decision-making ability, our judgment reside. So although anatomically those are two different parts of the brain, they're massively connected by literally hundreds of millions of neural fibers, right? So the two things are not they're not independent at all. And so the reason why these kind of challenging your emotions, as you were saying a minute ago, works is precisely because the emotions themselves are a result of basic responses, basic physiological subconscious responses and cognition. Let's take again anger for a second, right? So modern scientists differentiate two different levels of anger. The physiological one is the adrenaline response, right? So you're facing something that may be perceived as a danger, and now your fight or flight response kicks in. You're alert. You have a lot of immediate physiological response, like your hair stands up, for instance. You're much more alert. Your pupils dilate. Why? Because you get this adrenaline discharge. You're getting ready to either fight whatever it is that you're facing or run away. Right? That's the basic emotion, and you have no control over it. That's just going to happen. As soon as your perception system perceives a potential threat, that's going to kick in. It completely bypasses your conscious awareness. You just immediately start. But then once you are in that position, you start thinking, because now your cognition, which is slower, kicks in. It says, oh, I seem to be afraid. There must be a danger. What is the danger? Oh, I am in my house. I heard a sound in the middle of the night. So maybe there is a burglar. The burglar might be armed. I might be risking my life. But now all of this, it's actually your brain talking to you. You have no evidence that there is a burglar in the house. You have no evidence that your life is actually in danger. All you know is you heard of a rumor, a sound of some sort. Oh, then it turns out it's your cat that was going over the table and knocked something over. So now automatically everything goes back to normal, right? So the idea is that while there is nothing you can do about the physiological aspect of your emotional reaction, in fact, there probably is nothing you want to do, because there is a reason why evolution gave us the fight or flight response. Sometimes it will save your life.
Yeah.
So there's nothing you can or actually want to do about it. However, once you start having that cognitive part coming in and telling yourself stories, that's where you can intervene and you can say, hold on, does this story actually make sense? I'm upset, I'm angry because of this and that or the other. Yeah, but does that actually make sense? Do I have another choice? Can I interpret things in a different way?
Wow. I wanted to talk a little bit about this concept of, I think it's in Stoicism, the idea of the sage, like the ideal person, yeah?
Yeah.
In schema therapy, for instance, we have this concept known as the healthy adult, and we, as part of wanting to kind of help someone be able to develop and learn how to regulate their emotional experiences and have good relationships with other people, we try to develop and strengthen what we describe as their healthy adult. And when I read books on Stoicism, such as your own and others, they talk about the sage, and I'm just fascinated by the fact that these concepts are very, very similar, because the healthy adult is like an idealized sense of what you strive for, and it seems that the concept of the sage in Stoicism is kind of like the same. Would you be able to say a little bit more about that?
I think you're absolutely right. There probably are not that many, if any, actual healthy adults out there, right? We all have problems, but that is, as you say, the ideal.
We're all striving, I think. That's
right. We're all striving in that direction.
Striving to get somewhere there.
It's the same situation in Stoicism. That is, the sage may or may not exist. None of the Stoics on record that we have ever called themselves a sage, right? They Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, none of them said, "Oh, I'm a sage." They occasionally mention somebody who might have been a sage. Usually, that person is Socrates. The Stoics got Socrates. Yeah, the Stoics were very strongly influenced by Socrates. Socrates was the paragon of ancient wisdom and all that sort of stuff. And Seneca, at one point, one of the Stoic writers, says that the sage is as rare as the phoenix, the mythological bird that rises from its ashes. According to Roman mythology, the phoenix arises from its ashes once every 500 years. So that tells you that the sage is a rare figure. Right? It doesn't. And whether anybody has ever been a sage or not, it doesn't matter. As you say, it's what we strive for. It's the ideal human being. It's the human being that always acts according to nature. That is, that is always reasonable and is always pro-social. Right? He's always happy to help others, and he does so not by violence, not by subterfuge, but always by employing reason, always by solving problems by reason. There's another analogy there. I think that the Stoic sage is very similar to the Buddhist concept of an enlightened person. Enlightenment also is very rare in Buddhism. Actually, apparently the Buddhist tradition actually counts as how many people have been enlightened in the history since Buddha, and they're not that many. They're actually very few, right? But it's the same idea. The point is not that, we should all become enlightened. That's not going to happen. The idea is, think of the enlightened person as the ideal you're striving for. And then, you're going to fall short. But the less short you fall, the better it is. Epictetus actually puts it very explicitly, says, I am not yet Socrates, but I would love to die as somebody who strives to be Socrates.
You touched on this a little bit earlier, and I guess this kind of links in with this concept of the healthy adult / sage. This is this idea of a good life. And my sense is that you've mentioned, like, how do you live a good life? And some of the books you talk about, like, the striving for a good life. Can you define, like, what is a good life? Within schema therapy, we identify that there are sort of 5 core emotional needs, and we try to help people in therapy to be able to meet these needs in healthy and productive ways over their life, and that's perhaps a good life.
Right.
But how does Stoicism define a good life?
So Stoicism, I think, talks about the word that most of the Greco-Roman philosophies use is the same word to indicate what you're referring to, and that's eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia, yes.
Yeah, right. Eudaimonia means different things according to different schools of thought. But it's what you're striving for. It's what you want. You want to become eudaimon. Okay. Now, the term used to be translated as happiness. Then we now agree that happiness is a horrible translation because it means too many things to different people. There is happiness in the moment as a emotional feeling. There is happiness in the long term. It's like too many. It's too varied of a concept to actually be useful. Often, eudaimonia is translated as flourishing.
Right.
So having a life that, it's a good life. I think the Stoics would translate it as having a life that is worth living. And there is a big difference between a flourishing existence and an existence that is worth living. Clearly, a flourishing existence is worth living. There's no question about it. If you can, the way Aristotle, for instance, defined a good life is pretty much what you just said a minute ago. It's like, if you have your emotional needs that are satisfied, you have your physical needs that are satisfied. You're not in danger. You have enough to buy your necessities. And then you have your emotional needs, your friendship, your love, etc., etc. Then that's flourishing life. You're free to pursue your goals, and so you can do things in life, your projects, etc., etc. That is the ideal. That's the best thing you can do. That's a flourishing life. However, the Stoics recognize that a lot of people might not be able to get there because of material circumstances. Right? What I just described depends in large part on material circumstances. Aristotle said, for instance, that in order to have a eudaimonic life, you have to have, you do need to be a good person. Bad people don't have a eudaimonic life. You have to be a good person, so so-called virtuous person. But you also have to have a little bit of money. You have to be healthy. You have to have a little bit of social recognition, social standing. You even have to have some good looks. He said, if you're really ugly, you're screwed. You're not going to have a good life. Well, of course, sure. All of us aspire for that kind of thing. But some of us will never get there because of material circumstances. I don't control my aesthetic appeal, right? If I'm ugly or beautiful, that's not up to me. That's an accident of birth. I also don't control my education, the social milieu in which I grew up, all sorts of other things that I don't control. So the Stoics look at that and say, okay, a life worth living, at a minimum, is a life where, as we were saying earlier, you live according to nature. That is, you are helpful to other people and you are a virtuous person. You use reason in order to help other people. You can do that even if you're ugly, even if you're poor, even if you're sick, even if you don't have any, thousands of friends on Facebook or whatever it is, right? In all of those circumstances don't matter. And in fact, even the opposite is true. You could have all of those external things and be an asshole, right? And be somebody who's really not very pleasant to be around. I'm sure we all know examples like that. You can have a lot of money, you can be very handsome, you can have a lot of friends on social media, and nevertheless not be the kind of person that people want to be around. So for the Stoics, the good life is a life in which you interact positively, cooperatively, pro-socially with other people, and you use your ability to reason, your natural ability to reason, to do that. Now, if on top of that, you're lucky and you are also healthy or handsome or you have money, good for you. The Stoics definitely recognize that there is value. The word in Greek is axia, which literally means value. There is value to those things. But those things are not necessary in order to make a life good living. And what I find appealing in this view is that by those standards, pretty much everyone can have a life worth living. As I said, even under very dire external circumstances, which you don't control, they're not your fault. You can still be, when I was growing up, I knew a number of people who were certainly not rich, not handsome, and not particular social standing. I grew up with my grandparents. My grandfather was one of those people. He was that kind of, not even average person in certain perspective. He did not have, he had a stable job, but not a lot of money. Was certainly not handsome. None of those things. Nevertheless, he was one of the nicest people I've ever met. He was always trying to help other people. He was always kind. He was always reasonable. For the Stoic, that's what you want to be. Then if you on top of that you have the other stuff, great. That's a bonus, but it's not necessary.
It's interesting you're telling the story there about your grandfather, and the next question. Obviously, I want to talk to you a little bit about your books. So you've written 2 books, How to Be a Stoic and a Handbook for New Stoics, which I believe has been instrumental in popularizing Stoicism. What inspired you to write those books? What inspired you?
Well, the first one was How to Be a Stoic, and the story there, it's kind of funny. So I was going through a midlife crisis. I was having a number of issues in the same year. A number of things happened in a span of very few months that kind of threw me off my path, so to speak. I was hit by a divorce that I was not expecting. My father died. I changed job. I moved to a different part of the country. Now, any psychologist will tell you that one of those 4 things is stressful. 4 of them in a matter of a few months, that's a pretty big hit. And I found myself unprepared to deal. Up to that point, my life had been pretty smooth sailing. Now, not really much of a problem. The occasional, rough wind, but nothing major. That was all of a sudden a perfect storm. It's like, oh crap, this stuff is happening, and I found myself not having the instruments, the tools to deal with this thing. Yeah. So I thought, okay, where am I going to look for these tools? And immediately some of my friends directed me toward the concept of a philosophy of life. And especially I started studying Buddhism. That was the first thing that I try out, which is very interesting. And it certainly has the potential to be helpful, but it just didn't speak to me for a variety of reasons. First of all, I didn't grow up with that kind of language and that kind of tradition, so it was pretty alien to me. But also Buddhism comes with a number of metaphysical concepts that I, as a scientist, had a little bit of trouble accepting or wrapping my mind around. And so I said, okay, well, that's interesting, but no. And then I quickly found my way through the Greco-Roman tradition, which is referred to as virtue ethics. And virtue ethics includes Aristotle, includes Epicurus, includes the Stoics, all of these people. So I tried Aristotle. I studied Aristotle. Like, okay, that's interesting. But, this thing that I have to be handsome in order to be happy. And it's like, that doesn't work. I looked into Epicurus, also interesting. Epicureanism puts a lot of emphasis on friendship, and which I think it's in a simple life, which resonated with me. But it also advises people to stay away from any kind of social and political involvement because it's painful. It causes pain. And the goal of an Epicurean life is to live without pain. But no, I can't. And I can't see myself not being engaged sort of socially or politically. So I was in the middle of this process. And at one point, of all places, on Twitter, as it was called at the time, X now, I saw this thing that said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. Okay. And I thought, what the hell is Stoic Week? And why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? Because at the time, I thought of the Stoics, as we were saying earlier in our conversation, as, a stiff upper lip and suppressing emotions. Like, why the hell would I want to celebrate or let alone adopt that kind of life? But then I realized, I said, wait a minute, hold on. Stoicism is a type of virtue ethics. So that's interesting. When I was in college, I read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and that I remember that being an interesting book. And then when I was in high school, I studied Latin, and I translated bits and pieces of Seneca. Well, Seneca turns out also to be a Stoic. So I said, well, maybe there is something to this thing. So I signed up. And and the first bit of reading that I was assigned that year during Stoic Week was from the beginning of Epictetus's Discourses. And it just struck me as a thunderbolt. I said, whoa, this guy really talks to me. This guy is no nonsense. He addresses problems directly. He doesn't dance around. He doesn't care about his students' feelings too much. He's just said, look, this is the situation. Here's what you need to do. And he also has a, to me, very appealing sense of sarcasm. I respond to that kind of thing. And so I really started devouring everything I could read about Epictetus. And that very quickly led me to this thing. Now, the title of the book is kind of interesting. So after I did the early experiment, then I said, okay, I'm going to commit to live like a Stoic for another month and then another month, etc. And then at some point, I knew one of the editors of the New York Times, with whom I had worked in the past. I had written an article in the past. And I called him up and I said, look, Peter, I'm doing this weird thing. Here's a professional philosopher who is trying out a philosophy of life. Would you be by any chance interested in an article for The Stone, which was a online section of the New York Times at the time? The Stone as in the Philosopher's Stone. It was about philosophy. So this guy, Peter Catapano, says, yeah, sure, absolutely. Write it up. We'll put it out. That's great. So I wrote it and I entitled it How to Be a Stoic. And the column comes out, and Peter calls me out the following day and says, oh, Massimo, I'm so happy we did this thing because it's the most email article on the site.
Wow.
And I said, you mean the Stone site? And he said, no, the New York Times site. I said, what? Who the hell are these people? Well, all these people were reading, a column about how to be a Stoic. Okay. I hung up the phone with Peter. Like an hour later, the phone rings again. The phone never rings in my office. I was in my office at City College. It usually never rings. Students just knock at the door. They don't call. And so it rings again. And I hear on the other side, hello, we are from Penguin, the publisher. And we just read your column on how to be a Stoic. Are you by any chance thinking of writing a book about it? And I said, no, thanks for calling, but no, not really. And I'm not at this point, maybe, who knows, in the future, etc. Okay, well, let us know. Okay. An hour later, the phone rings again. Hi, we're Princeton Press. We read your article on. It's like, okay, this is getting weird. At the third phone call from a publisher in the same day, my response was, yes, absolutely. I'm writing a book about this, and I'll send you. I'll send you the proposal. So that's how to be a Stoic came out.
That's amazing. That's great. Look, I know we're coming to the end of our interview. So for someone who wants to start and explore and to understand Stoicism, where do they start? What advice or suggestions or books could you perhaps recommend that would be a good place for someone to start for this journey?
So first of all, a word of caution. There is a lot of stuff out there about Stoicism that it's crap, especially on YouTube's, especially on podcasts, of course, not yours. But so be careful, because there is a lot of people who are monetizing Stoicism, who are going into directions that, they think that Stoicism is a manly philosophy, that it's all about strength and all that. If you hear anything like that, just let it go, because it's not really real Stoicism. So be careful where you go. There's a lot of good stuff, but proportionally speaking, if you just pick up a random book on Stoicism, you're more likely than not going to come up with a bad one. So I would say any book by my friend Don Robertson is a good one. He's written, for instance, how to think like a Roman emperor, which is a very good introduction to Stoicism and to CBT therapy, to the connection with CBT. If you don't mind, I'm going to, of course, suggest How to Be a Stoic as an entry point. And the other one you mentioned.
This one here? There we go.
Yeah, that one right there. Yep.
Yeah, right. There we go.
Yeah, there it is. And the second one you mentioned, A Handbook for New Stoics, is a little bit more advanced, is if you really want to try to make an effort to actually practice Stoicism regularly, then the handbook is a good one. There are books by another colleague of mine, William Irvine, especially the Stoic Challenge, which I think is very good. It's not an introductory book, but it's very accessible, and so it can be used very nicely. And then there is the Practice in Stoic by Ward Farnsworth, and that book also is excellent. So there are resources out there. Just be careful what you pick, because you might end up in bad hands.
Well, I certainly can relate to the concerns that you can, or the red flags you can raise with some of the stuff. Because on Twitter, X, and YouTube, there's a lot of, there's this culture of Stoic, ideas or memes, I guess, where you have a lot. I don't want to say Andrew Tate. I don't know whether he does it, but it feels like it's in that kind of vibe.
Yeah, he kind of did too. That's right. Yeah. And that's right there. That's one of the examples I was talking about.
Yeah. Finally, where can listeners find more of your work or resources to delve deeper into Stoicism? Where?
Well, there's a couple of places. One is my website. It's massimopigliucci.org. So just one word, my name, first and last name. There you can find links to almost everything I do, pretty much. And then I have a Substack newsletter called The Philosophy Garden. And that's where I write regular essays. Every week there are 2 or 3 essays that come out. Usually they're about Stoicism or Stoic adjacent. They're about topics close to Stoicism.
Philosophy Garden, wonderful. Massimo Pigliucci, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation today. I'm inspired, and I hope our listeners will feel equally the inspiration that I have experienced from chatting to you about this. I think this is such an interesting and I see it such a practical philosophy and way of thinking about the world. And certainly for the clients that I work with, I've found that these concepts are very quickly understandable, and for a lot of those clients, and they're easily able to utilize them in a practical sense. And and I hope going forward, my thoughts are to try to understand more about the Stoicism and be able to integrate it more in the therapy that I do in a way that kind of feels seamless. So this conversation with you is part of that journey for me in terms of being able to get to that point where I feel that can be applied so well. Thank you.
Well, it was a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Get hands-on experience with schema therapy at the Forensic Schema Sessions live training. Visit psychclinic.com.au/workshops for more information.